Like many third parties, the Genesis was where Konami's relationship with Sega really began. There were quite a few of Konami's games on the SG-1000, but most if not all of these were unlicensed ports done by other developers in regions like Taiwan. Even Konami's Master System games were unlicensed MSX code that was ported by South Korean developers for the Game Boy, or their version of the Sega Mark III that was released by Samsung. It wouldn't be until 1992 when Konami would develop a game in-house for Sega hardware. While it was clear that Nintendo remained their priority in the 16-bit era, Konami did do some notable work for Sega that I'd like to take a look at here. This episode will go over every game Konami developed and or published for the Sega Genesis, including a very special Sega CD port worth mentioning. I hope you guys enjoy Konami and the Sega Genesis. In December of 1992, Konami would bring a port of its arcade hit Sunset Riders to the Genesis. They must have been super cautious to enter development for Sega, because they decided to use a tiny 4 meg cart for this, making a 1-to-1 pairing with the arcade content nigh on impossible. Instead of even attempting it, they made a sort of redux of the original content, changing the level design, assets, and length to accommodate the tiny storage. The result was still a damn good looking and playing game, and it even sounds pretty good. You get colorful sprites, great multi-layer parallax scrolling, and even a bit of speech. The gameplay is pure run and gun platforming with various power-ups and a heavy emphasis on score. It's noticeably pared back from even the Super Nintendo version in content, which itself came on a cart that was twice its size. I don't mind the remixed stages, but it's the extremely abrupt gameplay that really stinks. Konami tried to mitigate this a bit by making the few boss fights brutally difficult, but even these don't help in the long run once you get the patterns down. 2-player co-op does help, and the content that is here is extremely fun. I just wish there were more of it. This received no Japanese Mega Drive version at all. Also in December of 1992, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The Hyperstone Heist was released. It was known in Japan as Return of the Shredder, and in Europe as Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles: The Hyperstone Heist. Konami thankfully made this game using a full 8 megs of ROM, meaning that we get loads of great animations, sound effects, music, and a fair amount of content. This is based on Turtles in Time, which was released in the arcade the year prior. Like Sunset Riders, you are basically seeing a remixing of the original content here. The story drops the time travel theme of Turtles in Time and goes with one in which Shredder shrinks New York City with an alien weapon, and it's your job to undo the damage. It has fewer levels than Turtles in Time, but they are laid out differently here, and each one runs far longer with many more enemies to dispatch. The visuals and sound are both top shelf stuff. Color and animation are both excellent, even when directly compared to the source, and I consider its soundtrack some of the finest work Konami produced for the hardware. 2-player co-op is here, there are 4 different turtles to choose from, and it's all wrapped up in a presentation that does the comic and TV show proud. It's one of the finest beat-em-ups on the platform, and a must-own if you even remotely enjoy the genre. Konami kept the ball rolling, and in March of 1993 they released Tiny Toon Adventures: Buster's Hidden Treasure, a platformer based on the then popular kids show. So many people sleep on this title it just blows me away. This is a straight Sonic ripoff in nearly every way, but its levels are varied, it looks spectacular for a 4 meg cart, and it even sounds good. You are basically trying to find the exit while you collect things, with each level having nooks, crannies, and hidden areas all over for you to explore and find. If I did a Genesis Hidden Gems video, this would be in it. Rarely will you find a retro game of this quality so cheap for the platform. I have seen complete in-box listings go under $20 for this gem, an absolute steal. You'll have a ton of fun running, jumping, and collecting in this one. Everything else is just icing on the cake. It's another Konami Genesis release that didn't see a Japanese version. In June of 1993, Konami did a port of its popular arcade title, Lethal Enforcers, to the Genesis. Unsatisfied with the offerings available, they even designed and released their own light gun known as the Justifier just for this game. Since the arcade original used digitized 2D graphics for its entire presentation, you can probably guess that the Genesis version features heavy dithering in its attempt to replicate that look. This game is awful looking across the board. The environments, the enemies, the hostages, it's all a dithered mess of ugliness that rivals the worst looking games on the platform. Thing is, it's a hell of a fun gun game if you have a Justifier and a CRT. It's pretty much a 2D version of Virtua Cop. Enemies jump out and you need to pacify them before they shoot you. Hostages get in the way, there are car chases, and of course there's a big baddie at the end of the stage that has some super weapon trying to kill you. The only thing that really hurts the actual gameplay here is the lack of sensible two-player co-op. While the game does indeed support it, you must have a special pink Justifier that plugs into the normal blue model to access it. This is exceptionally rare nowadays, which means the vast majority of us won't be shooting it up with a friend with two guns blazing. Outside of that, it may be ugly as sin, but you'll have a ton of fun with it if you enjoy the genre. There is a Mega CD version of this as well with much better sound and music. In August of 1993, the Genesis got Rocket Knight Adventures, a brand new creation by Konami, just for Sega's platform. Oh my goodness, did this come completely out of left field for me. I didn't know what it was when I first saw it at the store, but it had Konami's name on it, so I had to give it a try. Boom! Awesome visuals, spectacular music, and unique gameplay made this an instant classic. You play an armor-clad, sword-swinging possum that has a rocket on his back in this mixed genre action game. Many stages have you platforming and using your rocket pack to get around the stage, while other places are sort of horizontal shoot 'em ups. Being able to blast all around the stage is fun enough, but the sheer amount of variety in how each stage is thrown at you is just as great. Some stages are loaded with environment dangers, while others throw tons of enemies at you. There are even some great boss encounters here that keep you entertained. Rarely could you say that a third party kept pace with Sega in regards to quality of software on the Genesis, but Rocket Knight Adventures here does just that, and deserves to be mentioned in the same breath as classics like Shinobi 3. It's that damn good. Konami joined forces with LucasArts, and in November of 1993, the Genesis received Zombies Ate My Neighbors, or just Zombies in Europe. This was an overhead adventure game that is themed with various bad guys from classic horror movies. The object is simple as can be: rescue your neighbors from certain doom. If a monster touches them, they're dead, and you'll have to search for keys and other items to find your way around the stages. Sometimes it's a simple neighborhood, sometimes stores, and sometimes a sports arena. Keep your eyes peeled for items, because sometimes the simplest thing can be the most useful depending on the enemy. This was ported from the Super Nintendo assets, and a few things are different, primarily the item and radar on the right hand side of the screen. It employs the GEMS sound driver, and I have to admit, it doesn't sound bad at all, and the visuals are loaded with little animations that really add to the comical appeal. It's two-player co-op as well. Konami again skipped a Japanese release for this one. Konami shocked us in December of 1993 with a one-on-one fighting game called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters, or Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles Tournament Fighters in Europe. I was so excited to play this game when I found it. It was a Street Fighter II inspired fighting game using the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. What the heck could possibly be bad here? Unfortunately, nearly everything. The character selection is awful. Instead of Shredder, the Foot Clan, Bebop, and Rocksteady, you have a tiny class of the Turtles, April O'Neil, Casey Jones, and a handful of nobodies you won't care about. There's even a character Konami just made up. This means that you'll be fighting against mainly your friends here, or what the game calls clones. That fighting comes in extremely unbalanced and with a computer AI that just spams the hell out of the same moves. It's a real shame because the presentation here is quite nice. The visuals are solid and the music is pretty well done, but I just can't play this stinker for any length of time. Konami made 3 fighting games based on the IP around the same time, and this was by far the worst of the bunch. A game can look and sound up there with the best of them, but if it plays like trash, there is simply not much else that matters. At the very end of 1993, right before the changeover of the new year, Konami unleashed Castlevania Bloodlines on the North American Sega Genesis. This entry into the much revered series had a heck of a task in front of it. It wasn't enough that it stood on its own as a great game, but it would be immediately compared to the other games in the same series. Lucky for us, Konami did not disappoint, and Bloodlines here ended up being a fantastic entry that did the series proud. It follows 2 new heroes that play similar, but have very different weapons and abilities for you to master. The visuals fall in with the more classic stylings of the NES games, but now have great special effects, giant multi-jointed sprites, and locations that break free of the usual evil castle motif. Castlevania can't be great without a killer soundtrack, and we got that too. The music here is a mix of old and new tunes that have a unique feel thanks to the FM-generated synth of the Genesis. Some of these are my favorite versions of these songs on any platform. It was released in Japan as Vampire Killer and Europe as Castlevania The New Generation, and is simply one of the best action platformers of that generation. Don't sell the experience short by playing on easy or avoiding the second character. It's all part of this epic journey. March of 1994 would see Konami resurrect its popular NES franchise on the Genesis and release Double Dribble, the Playoff Edition, known as Hyperdunk in the majority of the world. Many of us grew up draining three-pointers and landing killer dunks in the NES original, and I had similar dreams for this one. Unfortunately, Konami delivered a turd here. As much a football game as it is basketball, the gameplay is marred with an awful collision detection, terrible speed, and shooting that just feels broken. I like the large sprites, and it's one of the few games that supports up to 8 players at once, but the gameplay just cripples any chance of real fun here. I do advise you give it a try, but with so many other games in the genre that play better and have a real NBA license, this will likely be a big miss for many of you. Castlevania wasn't the only classic Konami series the Genesis would receive, and in August of 1994 we got the absolutely incredible Contra Hardcore. 2-player co-op? Check. Giant bad guys? Check. Multiple characters to choose from? Check. Incredible graphics and sound? Check. This is the total package of everything a run-and-gun shooter should be. It rivals the very best this series offers in terms of content, presentation, and fun factor. It's really difficult too, making you invest some serious time to see everything it has up its sleeve. Parallax galore and monster-sized enemies are everywhere. It does things most people will tell you the Genesis can't do, yet there it is on screen and telling you otherwise. You need to master its slide mechanic to survive, and there are different weapons and tactics to master from there. In Japan, it's known as Contra the Hardcore, and uses hit points instead of one hit and you're dead. And the European release is known as Probotector, and uses robots instead of people. September of 1994 saw one of Konami's most unique releases for the Genesis, Tiny Toon Adventures Acme AllStars. This is a compilation of sports titles that have been simplified to quick and easy to get into arcade-style games. You have access to soccer that is 4-on-4, basketball that is 3-on-3, a mad dash obstacle course, bowling, and a whack-a-mole style game where you must beat down Montana Maxes. It features 4-player simultaneous gameplay and is one of the best games on the platform for kids. It looks and sounds well above what you'd expect from a game like this, and the variety and choices definitely helps the fun factor. You can waste hours with the kids bowling and racing, and the controls are set up to be as easy as possible, including simplified rules for the other sports games. It's another one that's really inexpensive on eBay, and it's exclusive to the platform. Konami would skip a Japanese version of this one as well. In October of 1994, Konami released a sequel to its earlier hit, Sparkster Rocket Knight Adventures 2. Our rocket-powered sword-toting possum is back and ready to save the kingdom yet again. I did not like this game the first time I encountered it. I thought the graphics looked noticeably less impressive, and Sparkster loses his projectile-based main attack in favor of just the sword's basic close-range melee ability. Luckily, there are changes here to consider once you play it for a bit. The rocket-powered charge is now faster and automatic, giving you many more opportunities to use it, and making it your de facto ranged attack now that the sword has been changed. While I do feel the first is still a better looking game, this one isn't an eyesore by any means. There are still loads of multi-layered backdrops for you to ogle, and Sparkster himself is animated incredibly well. The first game had an excellent soundtrack, and so does this one. So much so that I prefer a few here over some of the original. The jetpack was a cool mechanic of the first title, but it's a star here, and I totally appreciated that it changed things up enough to feel new and different. It was known as simply Sparkster in the US and Europe. Also in October of 1994, Lethal Enforcers 2 Gunfighters dropped for the Sega Genesis. This was a sequel to the original Lethal Enforcers and was again a port of an arcade game that featured heavy use of 2D digitized graphics. And again, those graphics are dithered to the point of eye pain. Good lord, will you just be shocked at how bad this game looks. It's set in the Old West this time, and instead of car chases and machine guns, you get wagons, arrows, and cannons slung at you. Unlike the original, this was sold without the gun in most regions, meaning that if you didn't buy the first, you were kinda SOL. It did not work with other light guns, meaning that again, 2 players with 2 guns were lost to most owners. There is a Sega CD version of this game as well, and again it has much better sound and music over the cartridge version. Despite all of that, it remains a fun shooter if you can get over the awful visuals and unrealistic 2-player requirements. Konami scooped up the Animaniacs license and released a Genesis version of it in November of 1994. This platformer has puzzle elements that's similar to games like The Lost Vikings. You control the three main cast members from the show, each with their own abilities. You must use these abilities to get past obstacles and enemies across different movie sets in Warner Bros. Studio. Like most of the games Konami did on the Genesis, the visuals and sound here are solid and well done. Everything on screen is animated impressively, and it's all colorful and well detailed. The music is again well above the normal dreck you heard from other third parties and captures the feel of the show perfectly. This was another one Konami skipped in Japan, though it was ported to the Game Boy a few years later. The very last game released for the platform hit the Mega Drive in late 1996, International Superstar Soccer Deluxe. This 8-player soccer game would not see a US or Japanese release, and I wouldn't play it until many years after the fact. I must say, however, this is one kick-ass game of football. Large, well-animated sprites adorn a great-looking field that is loaded with touches like cameramen in a jumbotron. The fantastic presentation just blew me away, and I realized why once I saw Konami had outsourced this to skilled developer Factor 5 of Turrican fame. Those guys knew what the heck they were doing, and this late-life sports title was definitely worth picking up even then. It made its way to Brazil in late 1997 as well. Konami also published Nigel Mansell's World Championship Racing in 1993 for the European territory. It was originally a property of GameTech and Gremlin Software, but Konami picked it up exclusively for release in the UK, France, and Denmark. It's not a bad take on the sport, but it's kinda tame with little trackside detail and tracks that all look the same. There are much better racing games on the Genesis, though I can't say I hated it. This was never released in Japan. Konami was also all set to publish Mega Turrican in mid-1993, but something happened and Konami dropped the title completely. It languished in limbo for almost a year before Data East stepped up to publish the title in the US, and Sony handling it in Europe. Most of you are likely well versed in this game's charms. Excellent music, top-notch graphics, and run-and-gun gameplay with a good dose of platforming all define this excellent experience. It's another one that was never released in Japan. In my Capcom Sega Genesis video, many of you lamented the fact that I omitted Final Fight from the list. Since you have spoken, I'll not skip Snatcher for the Sega CD. Developed in-house by Konami and released in the US and Europe in late 1994 and early 1995, this is a graphic adventure game done by industry legend Hideo Kojima. It uses the storage of the CD media to bring a top-notch cinema-driven presentation and a movie-caliber soundtrack. The story centers on Snatchers, robot-like creatures that steal people's skin so they can hide in plain sight. Your job is to hunt down these Snatchers and eliminate them. Of course, nothing is ever easy, and you have all kinds of personal problems, including amnesia. The world is still reeling from a biological attack that wipes out Asia, and the effect it has had on the world's economy has completely changed society as we know it. The gameplay is driven by conversations and searching your immediate area for clues to advance the storyline. The only action that takes place is shoot-'em-up sections that occur here and there as the story unfolds. That story treats you like an adult, and I don't mean just violence and blood. It weaves a tale with people that have personal problems, demons, and it's all wrapped up in a world where nothing is sunshine and rainbows. It tried to be serious fiction at a time when people thought mature meant ripping someone's asshole out through their mouths. This is the only official English version of this game that Konami has ever done, which of course means that it's highly sought after and costs a fortune. You won't hear me say this often, but it's one of those games that might just be worth the price to own it. It's a gem that isn't readily available, and you definitely need to find a way to play it.
Gillian, I heard about Jean.
I'm sorry. I wish I could have done more.
You performed your duties quite satisfactorily.
That's right, it's not your fault, Gillian. Don't worry about it. By the way, the chief is waiting for you.
So how did Konami do on the old 16-bit workhorse from Sega? Not bad at all. While they did take a few shortcuts here and there with titles like Sunset Riders and Tournament Fighters, their overall efforts were usually A+. They nailed the Castlevania and Contra tag team completely, and the exclusive stuff like Rocket Knight Adventures and Tiny Toon Adventures were pleasant surprises. Rarely did you walk away from a game with Konami on the title screen disappointed, and that's saying something when many third parties just shoveled their wares over from the Super Nintendo with graphics dithered to hell and sound and music utterly neutered. This company catches a ton of flack these days for their questionable choices and business practices, but for us Sega fans, they came through in a big way during the 4th generation. One could argue that their efforts here easily trumped those for the Saturn and Dreamcast, and you wouldn't get much pushback from me. Many of these titles are excellent, easily rank among some of the greatest of the 16-bit era. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.